Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maria Demopoulos, and thank you for joining this very important webinar, The Politics of Fear and Migration, Why Australia is Better Than That. Let me start, of course, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are all meeting virtually and pay my respects to elders, both past and present, and extend my respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that may be joining us today. The conversation, as we know, simply can't take place without recognising that this is Aboriginal land. Sovereignty, of course, was never ceded. And the systems we're discussing today, migration, borders, belonging, sit on top of a much older and sadly unfinished history of dispossession, resistance and survival. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge and thank Settlement Services International for hosting this incredibly timely and necessary conversation and recognise the leadership of Violet Roumeliotis and the SSI team. As we know, the principles of non-discrimination, fairness and equal opportunity have long been central to Australia's settlement success. But what we're seeing now, proposals that seem to be moving us towards things like selective treatment, expanded surveillance, and the embedding of suspicion into the migration system. All of these things signal an incredibly troubling shift, a shift towards the politics of fear, suspicion, and division. And as a sector, we know that these ideas directly shape lived experience in our communities. They shape safety and how it's experienced in our communities. And of course, they shape concepts of belonging. We have an exceptional panel today, and they will be taking up these issues. It's a panel that, in my view, brings exceptional insight into policy, legal analysis and lived experience. But before we move on to that panel, we'll hear from Violet, the CEO of SSI, for some scene-setting remarks. Violet, good afternoon. How are you doing?
I'm
Over to
well,
you.
thank you, Maria, for lending your time and voice to today's event. And I know how busy you are as a CEO of Australia's largest and very impactful settlement organisation, peak organisation, Settlement Council of Australia. So thank you, Maria. And thank you for everyone for joining us today. I too want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of where I'm calling in from, the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to elders, past and present. I give thanks for their care of water, sky and country for over 65,000 years. I recognise the strength and wisdom in cultural, spiritual and educational practices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Around the world, politics is becoming a contest over who to blame and not how to solve problems. We're seeing the rise of movements that thrive on fear, division, and easy answers to complex problems. There is often an uncritical acceptance of the status quo. At the same time, long-standing systems many people relied on are clearly no longer working for everyone. And when that uncertainty grows, some political actors reach for an old playbook, othering, finding a scapegoat, creating suspicion, turn neighbour against neighbour. And they often ask us not to question, not to look deeper, and not to imagine something better. SSI's Critical Conversations series is about doing the opposite, creating space for critical thinking, open dialogue, and collective imagination. Because in this moment, critical thinking isn't a luxury, it's essential. Questioning, listening, and challenging ideas respectfully is how societies evolve rather than retreat. Australia's migration system is under pressure, not from the people who come here, but from the political debate swirling around them. In recent weeks, we've seen the opposition question the non-discriminatory foundation of Australia's migration system. We have seen proposals for extreme social media vetting, subjective values tests, and harsher enforcement models imported from overseas. These are imported political tactics, not serious answers to Australia's challenges. Today is about fact-checking and myth-busting. The fact is, Australia's migration framework already has strong security screening, robust processes, and clear requirements around democratic values and law-abiding conduct. This system has operated for decades under both coalition and Labor governments alike. We can improve it, of course we can, but we should improve it by strengthening what works, not by abandoning the principles that made it work in the first place. A fair, non-discriminatory system is non-negotiable. Every person should be assessed on their individual merit. It should not matter where someone was born. It should not matter what language they speak at home, and it should not matter what faith they practice. That is what a fair go means. That is Australia at its best. Australians want a migration system that reflects our national identity, fairness, opportunity, and dignity. Fear divides, fairness unites, and Australia must choose fairness. That's exactly why we're here today. These divisive ideas are being given a national platform, and now is the time to push back with facts, evidence, and lived experience before they become embedded in our national narrative. This conversation is about more than migration policy. It is about what kind of country we choose to be. It is about the long-term health of our democracy, economy, and social cohesion. In a moment, we'll hear from our panel of experts who will unpack these issues with the nuance and insight that is missing from our national debate. But before we get to that discussion, it's important to ground ourselves in the context we're operating in. What ideas are circulating and what Australians are actually thinking about them? SSI has commissioned Essential Media to conduct a national polling on the views of Australians about current migration proposals and the future direction of our migration system. Please welcome Clodagh Fullston, a research manager at Essential Media, to go through and walk us through the findings. So Clodagh, over to you.
Great, thanks Violet. Hi everyone, as Violet mentioned, Clodagh from Essential Media. And as part of the ongoing research we do fortnightly to monthly polling and tracking to really understand how Australians are thinking, feeling when it comes to a number of broad issues, but also just a general sense of how they're feeling right now. And so this data and research I'm about to show you, this is very much fresh out of the field. Data collected between Friday just gone, got it on Monday. So definitely very current and certainly enlightening. Let me just share up some slides here, 1 second. But before we kind of jump into questions specifically about immigration, I just wanted to share some broader context around how Australians are feeling. So this is a question that we have been tracking fortnightly or monthly for a long number of years, kind of showing data from 2022, but even tracking it before that. And I think it's really important to consider how Australians are feeling right now. And it's probably no surprise to anyone on the call. There's a lot happening, dare I say, cost of living, crises happening globally, shortages, and we're at peak levels of Australians feeling that we're heading on the wrong track versus, so 54% right now saying that Australia is heading on the wrong track versus 30% in the right direction. it's really important to think about this, because this general mood can certainly impact how kind of Australians are thinking when it comes to other issues such as immigration. Just worth noting as well that that kind of wrong track sentiment is strongest among kind of our older Australians, 55 plus, and younger Australians are more likely to think we're on the right track, but certainly still net wrong track. We also have a benchmark tracking question that we've been kind of asking on and off over the last kind of 7 years or so, where we ask Australians if they think immigration to Australia is generally positive or negative for the country. Now, going back kind of to 2019, we had kind of that general net positivity, so 51% of Australians thinking that immigration is positive versus 35% negative. But as kind of time has passed, and kind of when we asked this question a few days ago, we're seeing that balance swing a little bit. So now it's kind of pushing towards that negative view versus positive view. I think it's also worth noting that when we dive into the data and look a bit deeper, that those who are feeling kind of that Australia's on the wrong track and just frustrated with how things are going, they're significantly more likely to be thinking that immigration is negative versus those who think everything's going okay. They think immigration is generally positive. So just really worth keeping the general context and frustration that's rife in Australia and this kind of attitude about immigration. We asked a couple of attitudes to Australians to really see kind of, in light of what's been happening lately, what do they think? And we asked their agreement to a number of statements. So the first one on the left there being, do they agree that visas should be granted to applicants based on an assessment of their individual circumstances rather than assumptions based on their nationality? And we do have a really strong majority, 64%, agreeing that this should be the case. So Australians are supportive of this individual assessment as opposed to making broad assumptions. Similarly, when we think of refugee applications, a strong proportion, 59%, do agree that Australians should assess refugee applicants on a case-by-case basis, as opposed to banning applicants from certain countries. Just looking at a demographic breakdown, as researchers, we love looking at the detail in demographic breakdowns, but across both of these questions, you can see, for the most part, there's broad agreement across gender, age, and one kind of flag of misalignment, I guess, is in terms of kind of people who are intending on voting different parties. So on the right there about refugee applicants on a case-by-case basis, there is a little bit more disagreement among One Nation voters, but it is still worth noting that it all swings more towards more agreement than kind of disagreement across all of these demographics. We also asked Australians, just again in light of what's happening, to see what they think about social media screening and whether they think it's an invasion of privacy. I think we were, a little bit surprised seeing this result, but just 34% think that screening visa applicants' social media is an invasion of personal privacy. It's somewhat split there between agreement and disagreement. Similar across gender, more young people do think it is an invasion of privacy than older people. And again, we do see a little bit of a difference there when it comes to party alignment. What is interesting, though, is that there are still kind of a substantial proportion of the Australian population who are concerned. So 44% are concerned that allowing the government to review visa applicants' social media could be used to justify greater surveillance of Australians in the future. So that concern is largely driven by younger demographics. So, it's more concern than not concern among our 18 to 34, and a large proportion there, 47%, concerned among the 35 to 54 cohort. There is 48% not concerned. This is primarily driven by older demographics. So it is interesting kind of looking at our data. We certainly know that Australians are frustrated. This balance and swing between whether immigration is positive or negative for the country is starting to potentially push towards that negativity in light of the frustrations that are being felt around the country. But there still is this support for individual applicants' assessment and not just having a sweeping statement across for particular countries or rules for particular countries. The door, I guess, is slightly open or ajar for social media screening. There isn't as much as you might expect resistance to that, but there is still concern around what this might do. I'll stop sharing there. That is it from the data. I'm sure the panelists will have a lot to talk about in terms of what this could mean. Back to you, Maria.
Thank you so much for that, and it's amazing to sort of see that national polling on that screen. My goodness, lots to unpack and lots to talk about. And Violet, thank you for those introductory remarks. I think the point that you made about fact checking and myth busting is really going to feature very powerfully throughout this discussion. And of course, fear creates division, fairness unites. Some really important points. I want to introduce you to an incredibly esteemed range of individuals who are our panelists this afternoon. Let me start by introducing each three of them, and then I'm going to essentially put a series of questions to them. But Dr. Abul Rizvi is a former Deputy Secretary of the Department of Immigration and Australia's leading independent authority on how the national migration system works. He has unparalleled insight into how proposed policy shifts will practically impact Australia's social cohesion and the integrity of our borders. Welcome to you. And let me also introduce our international guests. And how fortunate are we? I understand, Professor Jennifer Coe, it's evening for you, but you are a prominent US legal scholar and expert in the convergence of immigration enforcement and criminal law. You bring a vital international warning to the debate, a very important one, drawing on your extensive research into US-style enforcement tactics. Hello, and thank you so much for making the time. And now it gives me great pleasure, of course, to introduce Mariam to you. Mariam Vazadeh is an influential lawyer, someone I've known for a while, an extraordinary impact on our political landscape, a diversity advocate and the executive director of Mind Tribes, with a career dedicated to dismantling systemic discrimination and promoting inclusive leadership. She brings valuable expertise on belonging, fairness, and the real-world impact of divisive migration debates. Hello, Mariam. Good to see you again.
No.
Okay, what an incredible panel. As I said, I'm going to start with Dr. Abul Rizvi, if I could. I want to start with you because before we engage in the whole politics of it all, clarity on policy is not a bad thing to achieve. As we heard from Violet, there's a growing narrative suggesting that Australia's migration system isn't sufficiently robust, that it requires more and more layers of screening, enforcement and control. But I want to ask you, if we're hearing these proposals, social media screening, tougher enforcement, selective treatment of cohorts, but really, is this any different from how Australia's current migration frameworks actually operate?
Well, Maria, thank you for that question. And the answer to that depends on which aspect or which version of the Liberal Party policy we're looking at. So the written version is actually different to the one that we heard from Mr. John O'Doniam in an interview with Andrew Clennell and an interview from Mr. Taylor with David Spears. So the written policy says there will be social media screening for Australian values as a standard feature of vetting. That sounds to me as if it would apply to every visa applicant. I noted in a couple of articles I wrote that would mean screening the social media of approximately 500,000 applicants every month. The system would collapse under its weight if we had to have visa processing officers going through everybody's social media for 500,000 applicants. Even if you used AI, you couldn't get through that fast enough. And as a result, I think the policy changed, not soon after it was announced. And it's now going to be done on a risk basis. But the written policy explicitly says it wouldn't be on a risk basis. But let's assume the written policy is now wrong and the oral policy is now the correct policy. So it's going to be on a risk basis. So then the next question is, well, what would be the risk factors that you would take into account? Because social media screening is already available to visa processing officers where a red flag goes up in terms of a particular applicant, where there's concern the person may not be telling the truth about something or other. They can ask for social, so that can happen now. So what would be different to what happens now then if it's going to both be on a risk basis? Well, apparently we are looking for, quote, bad people from, quote, bad countries. The only bad country so far stipulated is Iran. But of course, the number of migrants we get from Iran is absolutely tiny. The top 5 countries of migration, not including New Zealand, which is always a special case, are India, China, the Philippines, and the UK. So are any of those bad countries? And if none of those are bad countries, then really you don't actually do much through the kind of targeted screening that they're suggesting is going to take place. The second question is, okay, we at the moment have a thing called the character test, which is designed to identify, quote, bad people. And it's actually a very powerful test. And we exclude a lot of people based on character. But that predominantly goes to issues of criminality. It does also go to issues of people who may be intending to vilify certain portions of the community in Australia, particularly public speakers tend to do that, or they might seek to incite discord in Australia. Social media influencers tend to fit into that category, and they sometimes get refused on that basis. So who is going to be refused that is not already refused under the character test? Okay, it's going to be on the basis of their values, their Australian values. So let's go through a few of those Aussie values. One of them is the value of the fair go. So how does a visa processing officer determine whether a particular applicant is committed to the value of the fair go or not? Is someone, for example, who is particularly supportive of Mr. Trump committed to the value of the fair go? Is someone like that committed to the value of respect for Australian law? I think once we get into making judgments around that space, it would be a horrifying process legally, in terms of cost, and in terms of the uncertainty of outcomes. Frankly, it would just be an utter mess.
So, in fact, it's just creating more problems, isn't it? It's not actually solving anything. It sounds to me like we already have those robust checks in place. What we're really proposing is a whole series of complexities that, in my view, just blow my mind. But that's what I'm hearing you say.
I don't think they're intending to implement this.
Right, okay.
Okay, this
So
is just for the Farah by-election. Then?
Right,
yeah,
okay, right.
I mean, no one in their right mind would implement this.
Right, right. My goodness, my goodness. Look, thank you for that. I do want to sort of lean into to Jennifer, if I could, and bring her in here, because it does feel like there's a bit of sort of importation going on here, where there's a bit of a Trump dump is a term that I'm hearing here. I mean, we're seeing a lot in the global sort of pattern, particularly visible in the US, where people are being sort of more, or migration's being absorbed more into security and criminal justice frame rather than actually looking at people as participants in society. But Jennifer, if your perspective, I think particularly at that global level is very interesting. Could you talk us through what is it like living through the US right now in what we are seeing is an incredibly scrutinised environment and a scrutinised approach to migration?
Definitely. And thanks so much for having me. I study immigration law. I teach at a law school, and I've spent a number of years earlier in my career representing immigrants, including those in immigration detention facilities, seeking asylum, facing deportation, and navigating through the system. I guess I'll quote from my earlier panelists to say, perhaps in short, what we have is an utter mess. President Trump won the election in part due to an explicit campaign for mass deportations. And he would routinely vilify and demonize people based on immigration status, based on identity, based on race, based on origin, sort of you name it. So, I mean, the truth is, it's not possible to paint, I'll paint one perspective on where we are now. And in some ways, there is too much detail. But just to provide a rough sense, I'll provide some data points. I think we're at the place now where really indiscriminate arrests and detentions of people have happened. We hear a lot about people just being snatched up off the streets. And despite rhetoric from the federal government that they would target the quote, worst of the worst, a majority of those individuals have been people without prior criminal convictions. This mass deportation policy has really come at a devastating financial cost. For example, the federal government has sought $175 billion for the next 4 years. Immigration enforcement has become one of the highest funded federal agencies, really in history. And in many ways has shocked many people's sense of who we are as a country, of our sense of decency and dignity. And so whether that has come in the form of sending people to a torture site in El Salvador, to detaining and deporting children, to witnessing the murder of US citizens in broad daylight by immigration enforcement agencies, it really has unsettled, again, our sense of social cohesion and national identity. We're at a place now where the US is one of the wealthiest and arguably most powerful countries in the world, and yet devoting so much of our energy and resources to maximizing the suffering of the most vulnerable of the world. We have more or less ended asylum and refugee protections, of course, with a loud exception for certain white South African applicants. And so all of this has really come at an untold human cost in terms of families being separated, violence being faced by those who originally fled their countries, fleeing persecution, and has really affected people's sense of security in communities that have been impacted by these policies. It has not been about compliance with the law. In the United States, people who are supportive of mass deportation often talk about people having not kind of done things the right way or followed the law. But where we are now is that, in fact, it is people who have been living lives and who have in fact done things the right way, who have obtained permission to work, who have filed paperwork, who have availed themselves of the legal process, who have filed taxes. They are now finding themselves really subject to state violence in all of these forms. And it's, of course, trickled down into things as simple as just the effect of fear and what happens when fear and cruelty are used as explicit governmental policy, people not leaving their homes, not sending their children to school. Okay, I don't want to completely depress us all, and I certainly don't want to paint a picture of sort of America's worst moral depravities. I will just kind of conclude by saying I think bearing witness to some of this has also showcased surprising levels of generosity and compassion amongst some Americans. We're seeing networks of people delivering groceries, giving rides to children to school, showing their immigrant neighbors a level of care and compassion really at the local level. So I would just sort of end with that.
But Jennifer, it is quite. Let me just ask you one further question, if I could. I mean, the irony is that these kinds of policies are supposedly aimed at promoting a more cohesive society, a more sort of protected and safe society. It sounds to me, from what you're saying, it's actually undermining the very objective of social cohesion. I mean, that's its impact, isn't it?
Absolutely.
These things don't work. They don't work.
I think that would be a very fair way of putting things. Yes.
Yeah. And so, do you actually see some change? You mentioned examples of where communities are showing empathy and compassion and the best of our communities. I know prior to this, we were also talking about some examples where First Nation communities were extending their support again on land that's originally theirs to people that are being threatened with deportation.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's the thing I think we are going through. And that's why I hesitate to say like this is just all of who America is and where we all now. There's certainly like many reasons to be critical and to be unflinchingly critical about where we are. And yet at the same time, like the story is not over, the story has not concluded. And I think we are seeing all kinds of creativity and love and grace and compassion being poured out, maybe in ways that the federal government may not be demonstrating by example, but that's certainly like at various levels, right? Whether from indigenous communities to just like other communities that have historically been impacted by violent, migration policies. We're seeing this unfold. So again, kind of the story is yet still to be concluded.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Mariam. As for communities, of course, it wouldn't surprise you for me to say that Muslim communities in particular and other racialised groups have experienced significant impact. If I could draw you into this discussion, what impact, Mariam, does that rhetoric that singles out particular groups, migrants, refugees, or faith communities, what impact does it have on that sense of safety and belonging? And I know you've done a lot of work around this, the register and so on, but could you comment on some of that? I mean, words matter, don't they? These kinds of things impact profoundly on communities.
Yes, they do. Thanks, Maria. Great to be here. Something Abul mentioned really got me triggered again. It reminded me of the comments about bad people from bad countries and the naming of Iran. And let me talk to you about a lived example. I hate the fact that I have this lived experience. I wish I didn't, but very relevant for us at the moment. My husband is from Iran. I'm from Afghanistan. Iran being in the headlines, it's something that's impacted our 8-year-old who's at school, at a public school. And he had been experiencing racist bullying from last year on and off. A host of things, some of which was Islamophobic, and irony is not lost on me that I'm the founder and the chair of the Islamophobia Register and having to report incidents of my own and of my children. And however, what really I think hurt further was noting that you had 8-year-old kids in the playground talking about Iran as the war was ongoing. And so I say that to bring, I guess, the lived example to it, that these words, the dog whistling that's happening, have real life consequences. And I know that we know that, right? I know that we know that. But for me, it's always a profound moment where I'm like, at which point does this stop? Like, it's something I experienced growing up throughout school. It's something that has very much, and I can talk you through the stats, I can talk you through the increases in Islamophobia. But I think when it hits home is when my husband and I having to sit down our 8-year-old and 12-year-old who's now in high school and have a conversation about how this will manifest in the playground and how to navigate that. And then equally having conversations with the principal at the school, having to then, engage with some of the parents. So I say this because the dog whistling politics, that these words that are uttered in Parliament, all by parliamentarians, don't stop there. They enter our schools. They enter our playgrounds. They enter into visibly Muslim women, Palestinians, any person of any difference. It flows into our workplaces. It seems into those conversations. It's conversations that are had at dinner tables. It's the exclusion that applies. It's the quiet exclusion that can happen in our workplaces and in corridors of power where you don't know that exclusion is happening. It can happen. It manifests in racial profiling, opportunities that are missed. These are just some things that both I have experienced and that we have seen reports of at the Islamophobia Register. And the other thing I want to note is specifically the targeting of Palestinian communities. And PARA, which is an organisation, a Palestinian-led organisation by Rasha Abbas, actually did issue a press release in the immediate aftermath of Taylor's comments, deeply offensive comments because of the targeting of the Palestinians, specifically in his comments treating them as suspect. The statement they issued actually talked about, in fact, offered Angus Taylor and other leaders to actually meet with some of these Palestinians that are arriving from Gaza and the board of PARA to meet with him as well and to speak about the 1,600 Palestinians that they are actually supporting at the moment. The thing for me is highlighting that these words, do words matter? They absolutely matter. Words from political leaders are like permission slips. It is permission, and when you don't challenge the words that are spoken, they end up becoming actions. And I say that I've seen it myself in the last 6 months, in the last couple of years. And in terms of Islamophobia, we know in the last couple of years, there was a 619% increase in the immediate aftermath of the Bondi terror attacks. The figures were at about 740%. And we also know that that's the tip of the iceberg. Islamophobia Register is not well resourced, in fact, struggling to get ongoing funding. And racism and Islamophobia does not have an expiry date, as I say to government. But we know that political rhetoric throughout the 12 years that I've been looking at this, we absolutely notice spikes in incidents off the back of political rhetoric. So words absolutely translate into actions. And as I said, whether it's 8-year-old child being, called out in the playground, or people of various backgrounds that are being targeted, feeling exclusion and having broader impacts in the workplace, it absolutely is a real concept. And the thing is, belonging is not a soft concept. It drives mental health, workplace participation, civic engagement. When people feel unsafe, they contract, they stop contributing. Australia can't afford that loss. And I think for me, both having lived it in the last couple of years, and there are things I can't talk about. What I can say is that racism and Islamophobia and xenophobia makes you sick, physically unwell, and that's something I've actually experienced personally in the last couple of years. But also from a data sense, from looking at the reports that are coming through, we know this is not unique. We know this is happening across the board, and the impact on Palestinian communities that are, and I feel like I don't need to explain this. They have endured so much, and then to be subject to this kind of dog whistling is not just deeply offensive, but has much broader implications. And it really concerns me, because I thought that I'd seen the worst of it. And somehow, the bar keeps rising, and you really just go, how long do we have to hold our collective breath?
Mm-hmm. And look, the impact on those communities is significant. It's horrifying to hear you talk about some of that. But the irony of a kind of current discourse around social cohesion and promoting it as an ideal, the fact of the matter is these things are effectively undermining that objective, and its impact is being felt on all communities. Is that what you're seeing?
Yes, absolutely. It is undermining. And I think if we reflected, and maybe this is something we'll talk about, but if we reflect on the events of the last week as well, with the horrendous booing of First Nations leaders at, 3 Anzac ceremonies across the country, the people that are doing that kind of, the booing, so to speak, are also the similar cohorts of people that are demonizing Palestinian communities online, or engaging in Islamophobic rhetoric, or engaging in anti-Semitic rhetoric. So I think there are broader implications, absolutely. And, there are experts on this call that can speak to the causes of that, and much better than I can. But we know when there is general anxiety, economic insecurity, all those things, that what we tend to do is pin all of our frustrations on those that are already most vulnerable. So the refugees and immigrants become the scapegoat, and it's just an easy target. And, Violet made some wonderful opening remarks that speaks to all of these issues. But we've seen this throughout history. We've seen this throughout time, whether it's the targeting of First Nations communities or broader targeting of migrants. It's always those that are, most vulnerable that are going to be the targets, and they're also going to feel the impact the most. But there is broader societal impact. It is undermining social cohesion more broadly. And what concerns me is that the sort of multiple cuts, it's sort of death by 1,000 cuts, right? It gets to a point where you go, how do you recover from this? How do you actually recover from the ongoing onslaught of political rhetoric and dog whistling? Because where does it actually end? And
that's a great question, I think. Can I draw the whole panel in, perhaps, because I think leading into this question, just to get a breadth of perspective from all of you, can I ask the general question to each of you? Look, there are issues of concern, clearly, housing, cost of living, and so on. But we obviously want to create a migration debate over the next 12 months. We know that it's there, but how do we do that in a way that doesn't generate fear, that actually brings people into a conversation that is about nation building, that is about social cohesion? Can I invite any of you to reflect on that? Abul, perhaps, if I could ask you.
As the older person in the group,
please, you've seen some changes over the years.
A little bit of history.
Yes.
Issues around concerns about immigration go up and down, and have gone up and down for the last 50 or 60 years. What is different over the last 3 or 4 years is the intensity, and that changed. And we have to ask ourselves what changed, and it predominantly changed post-COVID. What changed post-COVID in Australia? I can't comment on other places. It may have changed already in other places. What changed that made things so different compared to the situation since post-war migration started? And in my view, 2 things changed. One, we had that very, very large increase in net migration to levels we've never seen before. They were unforecast by the Treasury, and they were a surprise to the Treasury, and they were a surprise to the government. The government then came out and said, oh, don't worry about it. It's just catch up. We'll go back to normal. Nothing to see here. My suspicion is the bulk of the Australian public didn't swallow that explanation. And you can put, the lack of understanding of that explanation down to racism, or more genuine actual problems. And I suspect it wasn't predominantly racism. It was genuine issues around infrastructure, housing, congestion, etc. those sorts of things. Now, whether it was right to blame immigration on that or not, I don't know, but a lot of people did. And that is part of, I think, why we are where we are. That's one reason. The second big difference between pre-COVID and the situation post-COVID is that every immigration minister that I've either worked for, and I've worked for a lot of them, or since Arthur Caldwell, although I didn't work for Arthur Caldwell, since Arthur Caldwell has seen their primary job as being to explain to the Australian public the merits of the migration program they were delivering. Here's my migration program, and here is why it is good for Australia. Let me explain it to you. Every immigration minister has done that. I have not heard Mr. Burke do that once. Why not?
Thank you. I am going to draw in some questions that the audience are asking, and we're limited obviously in time. We'd love to respond to each of those, but please use the question function if you do have questions. Michael Smith from the Eastern Community Legal Centre asks us this, and Jennifer, I might draw you in here at this point. We're seeing, especially in the US, the politicisation of news media and social media algorithms fueling division, and it's difficult to see where constructive conversation can actually occur. Jennifer, the question to you is, have you seen examples where we can break the bubbles and the silos so that we can facilitate constructive conversations? Are there any insights, any examples that you have to share with us?
Sure. I mean, it's such a great point, because when you bring in the algorithm and, one of the things I was going to say, Maria, in response to your earlier question about how we even have a conversation, was that we need to start from a baseline of respect for truth and facts. But unfortunately, immigration is an arena in which truth and facts seem to be most willing to bend first. It's the arena in which elected officials and public officials, or those campaigning for power, can, right, scapegoat and just make up any manner of lies and allegations and name calling, and it goes, without any kind of accounting for. So in response to the question of examples where I have seen, productive conversation happen, I guess my mind first goes to just like in-person gatherings amongst people with some sense of shared values, some baseline commitment to truth. And these have not necessarily been, in fact, they have not been, on the news or publicized in any way. Sometimes I have found the most authentic conversations happen when they are not being recorded, when people are in conversation with each other, and willing to listen. I guess just and funny because I know the church in America, the Christian church in America has just a lot of varying views on immigration and a responsibility to bear for where we are. But actually, some of the most productive conversations, I will say, I have seen take place in my church community.
There you go. Mariam, I know you've had extensive experience with grassroots communities. Are you seeing something similar in terms of what communities on the ground are saying?
So yes, I think.
I mean, constructive ways forward where we often talk about communities having solutions to some of these issues. Are you seeing some positive conversations?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I was a little bit, involved with the recent sort of Taliban 2.0 with Afghanistan. I was involved in some of those conversations, some policy conversations. I've been less involved more recently, I'd say. I'm familiar with what Para is doing with the Palestinian arrivals. But I think in terms of positive conversations amongst communities, my broader issue around this is that impacted communities often carry the heaviest load. They're having to deal with the consequences of what ultimately, if we think about it, is, Australia and the Western world are kind of involved in the architecture. They're the architects of some of this instability that is driving people to flee these countries. And then we kind of turn around and treat people escaping that instability as a threat or with suspicion. And so those impacted communities are already trying to support arrivals, and then they're also tasked with the job of trying to figure this out. And I just, I think broadly, government should be doing better in this regard. And I particularly note what Abul just said about, Minister Burke's not commenting, the lack of comments on his part, and how you connected that to what previous immigration ministers have said. I think communities themselves are doing an exceptional job under incredible circumstances, but often, as is the case when it comes to racism or different isms throughout society, those that are heavily impacted by it shouldn't be tasked with the burden of trying to also overcome it and address it. So that's just a broader point I would make.
Yeah, no, it's very, very important. Look, I do want to touch on that that question of responding. I mean, the elephant in the room, and people are asking questions about this as well, is the so-called rise of One Nation. And Jennifer, I suppose, broadly characterised as an anti-immigration sort of platform that this party is propagating. But well, I might turn to you too, because that example was an important one about political leadership. But are we seeing indeed a shift to the right, or is it a fragmentation of the right? And what does this actually mean for the politics of migration going forward?
Probably a bit of both, I suspect, Maria. I mean, I recall when Hanson first became a member of Parliament in '96, a lot of people came out and were very strongly critical of her and her policies. John Howard was, how would I put it, using kid gloves in how he dealt with her. He didn't directly challenge her. But Philip Ruddock did, the immigration minister. And I think every immigration minister since then has challenged her and what she has said. But it's reached the point now where I can't find anywhere where the current government has challenged her policies. And you'd be surprised, she actually does have policies. I mean, they're not particularly detailed, and there's sort of a bit of thought bubble and a bit of mixed with a bit of dog whistling. But, they're policies. And she has about 8 or 9 of them listed on her website. And I've seen nothing from the government that says, hey, hang on, that is a problem. That is wrong. You can't do that. If One Nation has 25% of the vote, or whatever it has at the moment, whatever it's polling, normally you'd expect political parties to come out and start criticising someone else's policies when they had that portion of the vote. I haven't seen anything to that effect from the government.
Silence is a challenge. Can I remind people, if they do have questions, please do use the chat function or the question function. Can I ask, Jennifer, in terms of hope that you see going forward, because I would like to put to the entire panel as we near the end of the session, are you seeing pockets of hope where there is distinct changes in the way in which these conversations are taking place?
Sure. I do think that Americans are beginning to see how the excesses of mass deportation are harmful, and more people are willing to push back on that. I think the challenge there is this one is it just that we're unhappy with the excesses and the sheer, the extreme violence, right? Is it just that we're unhappy that US citizens are being murdered, right? And we just want to tone down that? Or is there something fundamentally wrong with resorting first to enforcement, resorting force to criminalization, resorting force to the use of these tools like jails and the seizure of people and the separation of families, right? I think there's a more fundamental question that we have yet to grapple with I think is starting to happen and may happen very well, right? In terms of like, who are we as a country and who do we want to be, right? Because migration policy has always been about that. And this question of like, who actually controls the borders and whose land is this? Right? These are fundamental questions that the United States as a country, I think, has done a particularly poor job of grappling with in terms of really acknowledging our history and who we are and how we have come to be, right? The experience of just forced migration and enslavement and Jim Crow and everything that we've experienced. Like the United States as a country has been particularly bad and has been really actively trying to erase that history. But in my view, it's all tied together. I pray and hope that we will get there. But as I said before, I think still, there's a lot of criticism of President Trump, but he is by far the only one who is espousing, heavy immigration restrictions. He has absolutely motivated many others to follow his playbook, not just in the United States, but across the world as well, unfortunately.
Absolutely. Give us your masses, hey? Bit of a reflection on the history, as you say. Who are we as a nation? Can I put that to the Australians? Because obviously the title of this particular webinar is We're Better Than That. I think we'd like to think that as a nation we are better than that. Can I ask you, Mariam, what does a migration system look like that reflects a country that is introspective, that does recognise the truth of its history and that is at its best when it comes to human rights and human empathy? What does that look like?
Yeah, great question, Maria, and a big question. I think what it looks like is a migration system that, is and a policy that is grounded in evidence, I think driven by compassion, that recognizes contribution rather than sort of manufacturing fear based on fake news, as Trump would call it. But I think the strength of any country has always come from its people. And from the values that it chooses to uphold together. And, I think how we treat our most vulnerable at, times like this says a lot about who we are as a people. And Jennifer, referenced how in America, it's very complex. There are those that are, that are still doing incredible things to try and, notwithstanding Trump's policies. So that exists across Australia, across the US, but I think we have to remember those that hold megaphones, and politicians hold those megaphones, and the media amplifies that, and the media is, I describe it as a shop front to society. When those messages are being amplified by megaphones and they go unchallenged, or those that are seeking to challenge them don't have the same platforms, the same megaphones that reach those audiences, the consequences are significant. And the damage is, I talk about, my children at school, talk about the human cost, but that's just one small example. The damage is immense and it will take decades to undo. And so that's why our intervention is so critical.
Oh, in one sentence, if you could sum up a migration system that reflects the Australia we'd like to think we are?
Oh, I just want to see a plan.
Right.
And I want to see a migration plan, and I want to see a minister explain it to the Australian public, as Arthur Caldwell did in 1945.
Yeah. Thank you all. I'm very conscious of time. We could have spoken for hours and hours about this very critical issue, but I think it really does remind us that migration policy is never just about borders and visas. It's actually about who we are, what we value, and whether we choose, as Violet said at the outset, fear or unity. Thank you so much to our panellists. What an extraordinary bunch of people you are. I do want to end on a couple of quotes that people have sent through, if that's okay, because I'd like to leave on a positive note. There's a terrific quote. We must not be a bystander to disrespect and initiate conversations about views so that we're all engaged in making change possible. And hope is hard to see in the fog of what's going on, but long term, we know the good people and good ideas surely will prevail, as they always do. Thank you for those comments from our audience today. If you want to check out more about the polls and the findings, please go to SSI's website, find out more. There will be future webinars, Critical Conversations series, so please keep an eye out on that. Thank you to all of you. Again, the panellists, thank you to a fabulous conversation. Looking forward to many, many more. Enjoy your afternoon, folks.
Thank you.